Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to listen to our manganese story. I will continue in that theme of energy transition, and I will explain how manganese plays the role in that transition and how our company plays its role, and also how we enable our investors to be part of that transition and get on board very early. Next slide, please. Standard notice, we are listed on the TSX Venture Exchange, on the Australian Stock Exchange, and on OTCQX. Next slide, please. Our company is a Canadian company. We were founded in 2014, and we're headquartered in Vancouver, Canada. Our flagship project is in the Czech Republic, which is right in the center of the European electric vehicle hub, and as part of the European Union, part of NATO, very advanced industrial country, very stable jurisdiction, business-friendly jurisdiction. We have our neighbors, Germany, Austria, Poland, Slovakia, so we're right there. Our product, once it's produced, can be delivered to precursor makers, to battery makers, cathode makers, within 200, 400 kilometers, all of it. We are the only sizable manganese deposit in Europe, and our value proposition is very strong because our deposit is not in the ground. It's actually hosted in tailings, in mine waste, which was produced from a pyrite mine in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. The mine closed in 1975. Ever since, these tailings have been sitting there. They are not properly lined. Our proposition is to recycle these tailings, produce the high purity manganese metal for use in electric vehicles, and clean up the site, properly reclaim it. It will be properly lined. Dry stacking method will be used, and we'll give it back to the community. We are well funded. For now, we have significant investors and significant support in the European Union. One of our largest investors is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They hold about 4%, and they invested 8.5 million Canadian dollars earlier this year for the advancement of the project. We're also supported by EIT Energy, another EU-backed entity that has invested in our company and is also able to assist us with negotiation of offtakes or getting us in front of the right people in the European Union higher up. Our ESG credentials are also very strong. First of all, as I said, it's a recycling project. The tailings it's a fine material. There is no mining, blasting, crushing, nothing like that. It just gets extracted. There's a pulping station, and it goes directly into the processing plant. And the processing plant is just literally across the road. That's where where we have secured the land for it. So again, no cost and disruption of local infrastructure by moving large quantities of tailings back and forth. We are going to recycle CO2 in the process. We will be recycling hydrogen in the production process and some of the reagents. So the only effluent is steam that comes out of the production process. We also will be using industrial water, so no fresh water will be used. Next slide, please. As you know, the main metals in the cathode of a battery, some of the chemistries have manganese in it, some don't. About 50% of the cathodes that are being produced these days include manganese. And this is just an illustration that shows the benefits of manganese being the cheapest metal out of the other metals that are being used in the cathode. When you compare it to cobalt, the content in this quite widely used NMC, nickel manganese cobalt battery, is about the same, but the price of cobalt is about 60 times the price of manganese. Being so close do each other in the periodic table. They actually can be substituted. So a lot of cathode producers, OEMs and precursor makers have announced that it will be increasing the manganese content in the cathode and then saving cost compared to using more cobalt, and that will in the end make the battery cheaper and more affordable to the end customer. Next slide, please. And this is just a few that have announced that. There is also a movement, for example, CATL has announced, it's probably the largest cathode producer in the world. They've announced they will be adding manganese into their lithium iron phosphate battery to increase range. As with nickel, we've heard that a lot before. There is projected a large gap between the demand and the supply of high purity manganese. The problem is not having enough manganese in as ore body in the world and not enough being mined. The problem is the processing facility, because out of all the manganese that is being mined and processed in the world, less than 2% is refined to the 99.9% high purity manganese that can be used in batteries. Next slide, please. Again, we've heard this already. The European Union, the United States, even Canada, they're all moving into localized supply and localized provision of critical raw materials. We have the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. There's a Critical Raw Materials Act coming online in the EU. The Global Battery Alliance is introducing a battery passport. So again, for us to prove where the material comes from, how it's been produced, if it's sustainable, recycling kind of content of our kind of product, and that goes into the battery. That will be quite fairly easy to prove with our project. Whereas these days, most of the high purity manganese comes from China, and we can expect that this information will be quite difficult to get, or at the same time, it's not as green production as we're proposing. So more investments will have to be made by the Chinese producers to actually meet the environmental standards in the European Union. Okay, next slide, please. This is a little bit on the deposit. So we have about 27 million tons of reserve for in the tailings. The average grade is about 7.4% of manganese. The grade is quite evenly spread out. That's the benefit of having the tailings, and it's located in like 3 different cells. We have done a very intensive drill program in 2017 and 2018, so we know what's in the deposit. The deposit supports 25 years of project life. Next slide, please. This is an illustration of the processing plant and where it's located compared to the tailings. I've already touched on that. So we'll be moving the tailings on an industrial bridge over a conveyor belt, so that the rail and the road that is right there between the tailings and the processing plant will not be disrupted, but we will be using, of course, the rail to move reagents and equipment into the plant and then moving the products out. We have also done a life cycle assessment of our project. We've announced recently that we have signed a long-term MOU for 100% renewable energy to be used in our project. And that MOU is with a Norwegian company, Statkraft. The LCA compared the use of the 100% renewable energy to the traditional Czech grid, which is mostly non-emitting, but still is nuclear, gas, coal, and some renewable energy. And the CO2 footprint when using the 100% renewable energy is about 50% lower. And we have just finished a benchmarking exercise to evaluate our project against other producers. And again, the preliminary results show, we haven't published that yet, but it shows that we're significantly lower than others. Sorry, go back one slide. Thank you. So this is the kind of a very simplified process. The tailings are excavated, and then they go through magnetic separation. There's a leaching and purification process, and then there's a electrowinning circuit to get us to the high purity electromagnetic manganese metal flakes. This is the first product that we go through. That allows us to have better control over the purity and the quality of the product. And then 2/3 of that is planned to be converted into the high purity manganese sulfate monohydrate. It first goes through a dissolution process and then another purification step and crystallization. The sulfate is what most our potential customers and what is mostly used now and delivered to the precursor makers and the battery makers. The other advantages of going through metal is that we can deliver the metal to a customer if they have their own dissolution plant, and that they don't have to go through the crystallization process again, but they can just dissolve the metal and then use the solution in their process. We can also potentially build that dissolution plant right next to them if there is as an opportunity. And again, we would be delivering metal which is 3 times less volume than the sulfate, and providing them with a solution right into their process. There are also, for example, Nano One, another Canadian company that we're working with. They're looking into a process that they call the metal to cathode material. So they already tested our metal, which we have from our pilot plant, and it was proven that it fits their process, it meets the criteria, and works for their process. So they go from metal to a metal powder, and then they mix it with the other metals, and their one-pot process is kind of under research and development. So again, like going through the metal and being able to change the ratio between the metal and how much gets converted, we're flexible in that. It gives us more options. Next slide, please. We have we have delivered our demonstration plant to site, and now it's being commissioned, put together, and in the first quarter of next year, we will be providing bulk samples to our potential customers. Some of them have already started their qualification process with samples from our pilot plant. And this will allow them to continue with the qualification and testing process, and some new potential customers will be able to start that process because it can take quite a long time. 55% of that output for the first year for the demonstration plant has already been allocated to potential customers for their testing. Next slide. We have published results of our feasibility study in July, and we filed the feasibility study in September. This is just a highlight of some of the economics. We have 2 pricing scenarios in the feasibility study. The price for high purity manganese that goes into batteries is not a public information. There is no quoted price. Most companies that produce this metal are private, and so there is no access to quoted daily prices. So we have engaged consultants, CPM Group out of London and the US, and Cairn Energy, which are called eSource now, to give us the projections of the prices based on the demand and supply needs, and also taking into account our position and where we're located. So the base case is just a 13% kind of risk-adjusted or conservative pricing that went into the feasibility study. Both of these scenarios are in there, but even with the adjusted prices lower, we get in a 1.3 billion NPV at 8%, that's after tax, and 4-year payback. The capex is 757 million. That includes 100 million, that's all in US dollars, 100 million of contingencies. And both the capex and the opex have been priced, all the prices have been quoted in June 2022, which, as we know, has been like a very high price environment. So as the supply chains stabilized and power costs or hopefully decrease, and some of the reagents cost as well. For us, it's the power, and sulfuric acid is the main cost in the process, and steel, obviously, for the construction. We hope that there might be, obviously, a room for kind of some savings and some decrease in the capex, but we're obviously focused on especially not getting that over the 757. Next slide, please. We have appointed our financial advisor for the debt financing, and we're in the process of appointing the equity financial advisor. Our financial advisor for debt financing is Stifel Nicolaus out of London, and they've been working with us since the end of June. There are 5 potential kind of pools of capital that we'll be looking to for the financing of the project. We've had, as I said, EBRD is already our shareholder. They, and as well as the EI, European Investment Bank, have expressed strong interest to be part of this financing. Then we've had a lot of good inbound interest from commercial banks that we're talked to, ESG funds. We're looking at that. Of course, the project fits all the criteria that they're looking at. The export credit agencies, again, we're already talking to some, because they can fund either some of the equipment that comes from their countries, or if the product ends up in their, let's say it's a German export bank, it ends up in a German car, then we can ask for loans or some support. And of course, we're talking to the OEMs that can become a strategic investor in equity or can provide prepayments or loans. I think that's, next slide. This is just a timeline, so all the permitting, financing, we hope to get everything done in the second half of next year. Then there's a 2.5-year build and 6 months for commissioning, so commercial production will hopefully start in 2027.